Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to our third and final forum lecture of 2022, hosted jointly by the University of Saint Katherine, San Diego, California, and the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies at Cambridge in the UK. As with all of the lectures in this series, a recording will be made available and shared in the coming days. These lectures are free and open to the public, and if you enjoy them and would like to support this initiative and the work of USK and IOX, please visit usk.edu/give and www.iocs.cam.ac.uk/donations to make a charitable donation. Your generosity is very much appreciated. Thank you. My name is David Williams. I'm the Program Director of the University of Saint Katharine's Integrated Interdisciplinary Core and the Theology Program. And as such, I'd like to draw your attention to USK's new Master of Arts in Orthodox Christian Theology via distance learning. Information for this program and all of our programs can be found on usk.edu. Now I have the honor to present our esteemed guest lecturer, Dr. Razvan Porumb, Vice Principal of the Institute of Orthodox Christian Studies, Cambridge. Razvan took a doctorate at the same institute, the title of his thesis being Orthodoxy and Ecumenism. His research led to the recent publication of a monograph on the same theme through Peter Lang in 2019. The link to the publication is in the chat. Razvan had previously completed an MA in Pastoral Theology, also through IOX, writing his thesis on deification and spiritual life in Orthodox Pastoral Theology. Previously worked for the Metropolitanate of Moldavia, in Iași, Romania, as editor-in-chief at Trinitas Press, where he supervised and was involved in the publication and translation of numerous books and journals, an activity he enjoyed for almost 9 years. Razvan has always had an interest in ecumenism, being involved in various ecumenical milieu and projects. He spent a one-year internship with the World Council of Churches in Geneva. Thank you very much, Razvan, for giving us your time and for introducing us to the fascinating and saintly Nicolae Steinhardt. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Father David, and thank you very much to you and Dr. Frank for inviting me to this event. Welcome to you all. Thank you for making time to attend this talk about Nicolae Steinhardt, about his approach to Christianity, which the title of this talk refers to as Relearning Christianity. And you may rightfully be intrigued and have a few questions on your mind, like, who is this Steinhardt and why have I not ever heard of him? And moreover, why should his perspective matter? Or indeed, why do we need to relearn Christianity? I will share a PowerPoint. So now, by relearning Christianity in this context, we mean simply bringing back to the surface some important aspects or a vantage point which we may have come to slightly neglect. Not learning something new necessarily, but rediscovering an ancient perspective which we could apply and use in our everyday lives in the world of today. Now, why is this Romanian writer suddenly relevant now? Partly because at long last, a translation into English of his seminal work, The Journal of Joy, is being prepared for publication in English by St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary in New York, more than 2 decades after Steinhardt became a household name in Romania. Indeed, one of the most important Christian writers in the country. The Journal of Joy is a sort of novel or a memoir presented in essay form with memories and reflections described in a sort of mosaic, not in linear fashion, extremely well written and captivating certainly highly recommended when it is published, most likely next year. And why is Steinhardt's vision relevant to us, you may ask? Because here we have a contemporary man who was vilified and convicted for his principles and beliefs, who was tortured and persecuted, who led a life under continuous surveillance and harassment by an evil totalitarian system. We're talking here about the period of communist dictatorship in Romania, which lasted roughly from the end of World War II to the end of the 1980s. We can see here photographs taken in secret by the Romanian Secret Service, the feared Securitate. You may have heard about this nefarious organization who followed him everywhere. We have a man who found faith in suffering and for whom his relationship with Christ, with his sacrament and his church, was an existential matter, a matter of survival, a matter of life and death. We have someone who found faith so essential that he wanted to become a Christian while in prison, though he had been born and raised in the Judaic tradition, so that he lives his remaining days close to Christ. What did this baptism bring for Nicolae Steinhardt? Immeasurable, limitless joy. This is how he describes his prison cell. It was a kind of long and dark tunnel. It has many of the powerful elements of a nightmare. It's a cave, it's a canal. It's a subterranean intestine, cold and deeply hostile. It's a barren mine. It's an extinct volcano's crater. It's a pretty successful image of a discolored hell. And we can see here, we can have an idea as to what that environment is like. And yet, he continues, in this almost fancifully unreal and sinister place, I was to know the happiest days of my life. How absolutely happy I was in room 34. Not even in Brasov with my mother in my youth, not even on mysterious London's unending streets, not even on the beautiful hills of Muschel, not even in Lucerne's postcard blue decor. No, nowhere. And this is not simply some hyperbole. In embracing faith, Nico Steinhardt, or later Father Nicolae Steinhardt, as he was to become, was literally tormented by joy. It is not only worries that won't let you sleep at night, writes Steinhardt. It is also happiness that can torment you, that can wake you up in the middle of the night, even in a grim place like a prison cell. In his words, I would suddenly open my eyes, he says, out of sheer joy, in the grip of a euphoric state that begot not torpor, as narcotics do, but watchfulness and life of acute intensity. Out of this overabundance, I felt like jumping out of my bunk bed, felt like running about, shouting with joy, shaking all the others to tell them how happy I am, to beseech them to realize what treasure they all possess, what cozy little stove, what wondrous sedative that requires no prescription. Now he refers here, of course, to Christian faith. And his witness, therefore, of the power of faith, of his encounter and life with Christ experienced in the harshest and most menacing of environments, may perhaps inspire us as we struggle in a secularized, increasingly hostile and divided world. Now, Nico Steinhardt, born in 1912, passed to the Lord in 1989, known in his later years as Father Nicolae de la Rohia, was born near Bucharest to Jewish parents. Educated in law, he proceeded to a PhD in the same field in the 30s, began his writing career soon thereafter, publishing literary criticism, philosophical, political reflections, some satirical pieces, establishing himself as one of the most erudite and promising voices of his generation. After the communists came to power and soon initiated a purge of dissidents and reluctant intellectuals in the 50s, he bravely refused to testify as a witness at a trial against Romanian philosopher Constantin Noica. It was not the sort of thing you were really allowed to refuse. He was consequently imprisoned alongside tens of thousands of other political prisoners who had been jailed by the oppressive regime. Steinhardt served his sentence in a number of prisons in Romania from 1960 until 1964, when a general amnesty was granted to all political prisoners. So he only did 4 of the 13 years to which he was convicted. In prison, as I have already mentioned, he takes the momentous decision to become a Christian and is baptized by a fellow inmate who was a priest. It's an extraordinary episode where they used dirty water from the trove of the prison. So they did not have, needless to say, any liturgical implements in prison. After his release, he writes his memoir about the happiness he had encountered in prison, which remains in a secret document up until communism fell. He was not allowed to circulate it. In fact, it was confiscated twice by the Secret Service. He publishes sporadically in various literary journals, and finally, in the 80s, he becomes a monk at the Rohia monastery in Western Romania, again in defiance of the communist atheistic state. Now you can see here some photographs of the Rohia monastery, known nowadays, particularly because Nicolae Steinhardt was part of the community there. Now, following his baptism, Steinhardt continues to explore in wonderment the mystical reality that slowly but constantly reveals itself from behind the sordid prison tableau. He is not alone in defying this dehumanizing environment. Other inmates demonstrate the same stubborn, dignified denial while accepting the calamity surrounding them, suffering unspeakable daily tortures and humiliations, shaking with cold, hungry and thirsty, like caged animals, wrote Steinhardt, whose food is at the mercy of a forgetful master, covered in slimy, sticky soot and braving pestilential stench. The prisoners do not deal with it as a tragedy, but remain kind and polite, prefiguring, in Steinhardt's words, the monk's quietude or heavenly joy. Again, we have this juxtaposition of almost opposing elements. We have the dirty prison cell, and then Steinhardt speaking about heavenly joy. Now, 3 years following his baptism, while still in prison, Steinhardt has a powerful epiphany, which confirms once again the profound sacramental dimension to his conversion. He had said that the minute he was baptized, everything changed in his life, the way he perceived things, the way he saw other people. So here is, in a sense, the validation, if you like. So in incredibly harsh and degrading circumstances, he is granted a mystical encounter with Christ. Following into a heavy sleep one night, he has a vivid dream, a vision. I don't see Christ the Lord incarnate, only a huge light, white and bright, and I feel unspeakably happy. The light surrounds me from all parts. It's total joy, and it does away with everything. I'm bathed in blinding light. I float in light. I am in light and I exult. I know that it'll last forever. It's perpetuum immobile. I am, the light says to me, not through words, but through the transmission of thought. I understand that it's the Lord and that I'm within the light of Tabor, that I don't merely see it, but I also dwell in its midst. Over and above everything, I'm happy, happy, happy. And I know that I am, and I say it to myself. And it's as if the light were brighter than light, and it's as if it spoke and told me who it was. It seems to me that the dream lasted long, very long. The joy not only lasts a long time, but also always increases. If evil has no bottom, then goodness has no ceiling. The circle of light grows ever wider, and the joy, after it had enveloped me silkily, suddenly changes its tactics, becomes firm, throws itself, trundles itself upon me like avalanches that anti-gravitationally lift me up. Then again, it proceeds otherwise. Tenderly, it cradles me, and in the end, bluntly, it replaces me. I no longer am. No, I am, but so strong that I no longer recognize myself. This joy, if it imbues Steinhardt's journal throughout, it is in turn inextricably linked to freedom. The theme of freedom is central in the journal and in all of Steinhardt's works, not only by virtue of the concentrationary, confined communist universe from which the author wrote, but it is fundamental also to his worldview. In relation to freedom, the author quotes repeatedly the Kierkegaardian adage, the opposite of sin is not virtue, the opposite of sin is freedom, a phrase which is for him the most extraordinary thought ever read, except for the gospel texts. Those were his words. Steinhardt reveals freedom's connection with the joy thus. In order to distinguish the Christian from the caricature or imitation, there's no procedure more certain than investigating whether the aspirant is or isn't cheerful and content. If the person is intolerant or sullen or agitated or sad or upset, he's not a Christian, no matter how faithful to virtue. The Christian is free, hence happy. Indeed, George Ardeleanu, one of the foremost Steinhardt scholars in Romania, spoke about a triangle of faith, freedom, happiness, which functions as theological core and central theme of Steinhardt's journal and of his other works, I would add. Faith, freedom, happiness. The theme of freedom remains present throughout, whether directly stated or as implicit undercurrent. For Father Nicolae, freedom implies responsibility and involvement. By association, faith becomes a deeply active, dynamic, participatory concept. In his view, the Christian spirit is active, always ready to engage. He repeatedly voices his outrage whenever he sees, and I quote, how Christianity is confused with stupidity, with a kind of cowardly and stupid piety. Steinhardt is vehemently against any perception of Christianity as a passive, submissive, or resigned devoutness. He best encapsulates his views through a humorous fragment in one of his books, where he retells a story about a group of monks who experience a blackout while they are praying. So they're praying, the light goes off. One of the monks goes to the fuse box to fix the problem, while the others pray for the light to return. Steinhardt believes The only really faithful person is the one ready to change the fuse. The others are falsely pious, shamelessly tempting God. Would they wish, he says, for Christ to descend from heaven with the fuse? An active engagement, an informed involvement is a prerequisite for the Christian. And not knowing what is happening around you, not following the events, not paying attention is not admissible in Steinhardt's view. I didn't know the answer of those who are told about torture, about concentration camps, about prisons, about the total admission of accusations, about political internments in mental asylums, is not a valid excuse, even if socially or circumstantially one is spared from coming into direct contact with the atrocities of the day. An elementary smartness is a duty, posits Steinhardt, thus raising yet again his exasperated plight against ignorance, immaturity, or downright stupidity, as he openly calls it. From this perspective, stupidity is a sin and a temptation, something Steinhardt repeats again and again in his journal from several perspectives. The blind passage through life and through things, he says, or the indifferent passing through life, are from the devil. And for Steinhardt, no one can ever claim to be daft enough not to see the evidence. The call to informed discernment is addressed to us all, particularly to those in the community of the church. Particularly relevant for the Christian readers today are his more practical views with regard to the way we live, to our necessary and constant attention, nepsis, if you like, our informed connection with the world. For instance, while acknowledging the limitations of science, scientific research remains a useful channel from which Steinhardt reads avidly and references on almost every page of his journal. Besides that, there is also the requisite prioritization of the truth that matters from a Christian pastoral perspective, in constant watchfulness for the safeguarding of the biblical commandment of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And Steinhardt quotes often Matthew 23:23, where we are shown the things that matter: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. An attention for detail and an awakened vigilance seems now required more than ever, perhaps, in the age of social media. Indeed, if Steinhardt saw people's blind or uninformed passing through life as from the devil, what would he have thought of the social media bubbles on Facebook, Twitter, and others, focusing on one self-confirmed but absolute truth, so-called, echo chambers based on the very rejection of dialogue or even engagement with the outside world? As such platforms encourage an acute polarization, seemingly seeking to thwart people's ability to discern the injustices, the relevant or burning truths of the day, he would surely see them as the ultimate weapon of the enemy. That's just my guess. Thankfully, Steinhardt's inspiring vision is still with us, reminding us that in all matters, Orthodox Christians ought to display that elementary smartness, that attentive awakeness, practicing and displaying discernment, and never isolating themselves into camps of opinion, never falling into one extreme or the other. For Father Nicolae, our ordinary everyday sins and imperfections, often hidden under a cloak of routine, are the ones to address, more egregious in a sense than any obvious depravity or crime. He wrote, I think that in all of bordellos of Paris, Hamburg, and Singapore, in all the places of perdition of all the ports and metropolises of the world, the sins committed do not cry more dissonantly and woefully to the heavens than the insults, sudden arguments, and gratuitous insults uttered with vitriolic hatred by the quarrelsome and morose. In a generalized climate of animosity and suspicion, the crowded buses of communist Romania or the long queues for food were frequently the settings for violent brawls and peevish outbursts. Such fits of anger and misery are not just isolated sins in themselves, but denote, in Steinhardt's view, a spiritual state, in his words, in unreconciled opposition to the God-created world, a willful and immense withdrawal from the acknowledgement of the vanity of worldly things. Allowing the joy of living be spoiled by trifling matters denotes a state of mind anchored, he says, in devilishness, caught in the quicksand of gratuitous anger. The biting, barked words of anger of the ill-tempered are precisely what we as Christians are called to avoid before everything else. And Father Nicolae quotes James 3:2 as his argument. And I quote from the New Testament, "For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body." Our behavior as Christians among our fellow humans should follow, Steinhardt proposes, a paradigm situated at the polar opposite, based on Christ's archetype as a gentleman and knight. These are his words, an unusual interpretation as he himself was aware. Christ is discreet. He stands by the door and knocks, trusting of people and not suspicious, full of mercy, attentive and polite, friend, he says to Judas, never an insult or a disdainful word to a sinner, faith in people, courage, detachment, goodwill towards the afflicted from whom you cannot derive any benefit, the predisposition towards forgiveness, contempt for cautious and frugal people. All of these, says Steinhardt, are traits of the gentleman and knight. Christ, he says, invites all people to recognize what they rightfully are in truth, sons of the Father, of the Master. From this point of view, the closest book to the Gospels is Don Quixote, since the knight from La Mancha tells those in the tavern that they're nobles without knowing it, and demands that they act as the nobles that they are. He was an enormous admirer of Cervantes and of Don Quixote. Time and again, in the Journal of Joy and his other books, the figure of the knight as universal archetype informs Father Nicolae's vision of the Christian, an archetype he has indeed encountered in prison, where, if you remember, I mentioned before, and the cruelest and most heartless of circumstances, prisoners are kind, all of them, and polite, remaining, as he says, gracious with each other, cheery, as only in prison people can be. Again, the paradox. The greatest happiness contrasted with the environment of prison. He gives another description of Christian life in one of his letters, which I can't help but share with you because I find it particularly powerful. I know now, he wrote to a friend, that any hatred, any aversion, any remembrance of evil, any lack of mercy, any lack of understanding, goodwill, sympathy, and any human interaction not at the same level of grace and gentleness as a minuet by Mozart or Boccherini is a sin and an abomination. It is not only murdering, wounding, injuring, robbing, cursing, casting out, but any vulgarity too, any disregard, any mean look, any contempt, any bad mood, all are from the devil and wreck everything. I now know, I have finally come to learn it. The Christian also should never be afraid, and fear is seen by Steinhardt as the main archenemy. Christianity, he wrote, is a religion of courage, and he is keen to bring biblical support for his position. Take heart, son, daughter, in Matthew. Don't be afraid in Mark and Luke, as well as Christ's admonition, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? In Mark 4:40. The first to be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur, Steinhardt notes, are the cowardly, after which come the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral. And this is a quote from the Revelation. Courage is the only thing that can keep us free, as ultimately no law, he said, no constitution, no court of justice, no juridical procedure can guarantee freedom. On the one hand is the physical courage of individuals, the sure guarantor of freedom, even or mostly when one is confronted with death. But we also encounter in Steinhardt an ideological or cultural type of courage. Christ doesn't only exhort us to be brave, but also, yet again, to be awake and engaged. And this is what Steinhardt paraphrased. Ask, demand, knock, dare, don't be afraid, don't be frightened, persevere, charge, be awake, be of sound mind. Commandments given by Christ as, in his words, in Steinhardt's words, it doesn't behoove us to be stupid. Now, having planted the root of his argument in the utmost virtue of courage, Father Nicolae wonderfully describes our engagement as Christians with the world without being fearfully ignorant, a calling for which he finds proof in the fact that God, he says, is a hidden God, that we must find him, discover him, that we must be able to decipher his world. We're not spoon-fed anything. Nature is complicated and dialectical. Beyond the complications and dialectics, we're asked to unravel it. Its meanings lie beyond the immediate reality. A vast riddle, he says, where only a sound mind can manage. And Steinhardt does scrutinize the world without fear, with Christ, an invisible companion by his side, engaging, besides theology, with literature mostly, but also with all arts, with scientific literature, with juridical and political sources, reading avidly and ceaselessly, and being au courant with all cultural publications or events. He was kept updated with everything, every scientific discovery. And he does mention quite a few of those in the Journal of Joy. Now we encounter this underlying and daring commitment to freedom and responsibility, this bold engagement with all forms of culture in all of Steinhardt's unabated explorations, both before and after his tonsure as a monk. He was always a nonconformist, everywhere searching for Christ's truth and for underpinnings for faith, sometimes perhaps in rather unexpected places, and formulating opinions that strict adherence to doctrine may find challenging. His admiration for the pop rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar for instance, which he finds profoundly Christian and to which he devotes an ample commentary in the journal, is likely to have raised a few eyebrows. Maybe even now as I'm talking, some of your eyebrows are raised, but I can't see them all. He was an avid, passionate lover of classical music, but he does not shy away from expressing his belief that a lot of the modern jazz or even pop musicians had grown in sophistication, their widespread reach through modern media, making their message relevant to their time. Pop music, Steinhardt once said, while never rising to the same transcendental heights as classical music, is the sporadic sigh of the historical and existential man, his gaze raised, be it furtively or infrequently, towards the skies. That's an interesting definition of pop songs, perhaps a tad too generous. Among contemporary musicians whom he sees as remarkable, he mentions Bob Dylan, whom he describes as a poet, singer, and legendary character, Leonard Cohen, the Beatles, or indeed Louis Armstrong, about whom he writes, "If any mortal is to blow the trumpet at the last judgment, he will surely be the one." Equally unusual with his admiration towards Dali's paintings, Salvador Dali, the Spanish painter, whom he considers to be a great Christian artist, or his constant addiction to cinema, praising films like Antonioni's Blow Up, Kubrick's Clockwork Orange, or Fellini's Dolce Vita, the latter revealing to Steinhardt an enormous Christian faith, he says, a full nostalgia of the Christ's kingdom. Steinhardt's Journal of Joy, as well as his other writings, be they in the field of theology, literary criticism, or aesthetics, engages more or less briefly with hundreds of sources from world literature, philosophy, theology, psychology, everything and everyone, the writings of Kafka, Churchill, Cervantes, Papini, Arthur Miller, Balzac, André Gide, Shakespeare, Hegel, Huxley, Saint-Exupéry, Bulgakov, and many others. Nothing and no one is too unsuitable or remote to be used pragmatically, in a sense, as a witness, albeit often indirectly, to the supreme truth of Christ. Steinhardt opposed tyranny and totalitarianism up until his last breath through subversive interpretations of literature and art. His engagement with his object of analysis invariably manufacturing a cloaked plea against the oppressive regime. He is not just a dissident, but an active fighter or opponent for freedom and against tyrannical structures of power. And the way he fought was through his writings. His writings contained hidden critiques of the totalitarian regime, which sometimes were so subtle that the machinery of censorship could not spot, so he would get away with them. Sometimes he would be less lucky. So his is the journey of a brave knight, constantly in the service of freedom and justice, fighting all tyranny, seeing the icon of Christ in every person, boldly exploring the world that God has given us and marveling at its complexity and beauty. In the face of uncertainty and disbelief, Steinhardt welcomes us all with a message of supreme hope. We are never alone. In an instant, Christ can join us wherever we are. With him by our side, we are flooded with love and joy and strength. With him by our side, we are invincible knights on a noble and cheerful quest. So, together with Saint Silouan the Athonite, Father Nicolae Steinhardt would also say, keep your mind in hell and despair not. But he probably would add, and be happy, happy, happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Razvan, for that fantastic and detailed introduction to this character, this gentleman and knight. Before there'll be a few minutes for questions and comments, but I'd first like to just turn it over. If anyone would like to ask a question, would you you can either raise a virtual hand, or if you want, you can just unmute and just jump straight in. That's perfectly fine. No one's going to be brave. Let me just say just one thing that I find to be incredible about this man. I think 1903 is his birth date. Is that correct? 1903.
1912.
1912. Okay. All right. 1912 is his birth date. 2 world wars and communism and this lengthy imprisonment, and yet joy and the emphasis on being duty bound to be happy as well. It's absolutely extraordinary. I said 1903. That must be the year that Father Dimitris Steinhardt was born.
I think you're right. Yes, I think you're right.
There are some similarities that I see here. I mean, just as someone with a very sort of superficial knowledge of both of these great men, but during Father Dimitris' imprisonment, he also has, I don't think in such explicit terms, you know, the passage that you read about the the uncreated light, this experience that he has. But Father Dimitri talks also about the necessity of prayer to maintaining freedom, his own personhood and his freedom as well. Do we know if the two of them were corresponded or had any kind of contact?
Father Nicolae was a great admirer of Steinhardt, that's for sure. I don't know whether they've met. I was asked this question before, actually. I know that I've just bought fresh off the print his 2 volumes of correspondence. I know he wrote a letter to Steinhardt, thanking him for one of his books, and you know, but I don't think he received a reply. All of this correspondence, by the way, and everything was, we have to keep in mind, monitored by the Secret Service. So every single letter he wrote, sent or received, would have passed through a complicated system, and some of the things would have been, you know, confiscated. Some of the things would have been let go. He was a great admirer of Steinhardt, that's for sure. Steinhardt also had been to prison, I think also for about 4, I can't remember exactly, 4 or 5 years probably. But it was, a lot of people went to prison in those days, particularly academics, whoever, you know, had an opinion that was felt to be subversive. You didn't even have to have an opinion, even if you knew certain people who had been convicted. Now you were somehow guilty, presumed guilty by association. Indeed, Steinhardt, all that he did himself was just to say, I'm not going to testify against this man. I don't think there is something wrong with that. That was already a crime. And I think another thing about Steinhardt and Steinhardt and their, you know, focus on freedom, sometimes you have to have a little taste of totalitarian lack of freedom to understand the value of freedom. I sometimes look at people these days, certain contexts, becoming more and more authoritarian. And I was 20 years old when because the communist regime fell in Romania. So I got to live quite a lot through it and to know what it's like. But perhaps it's also a good lesson to understand just how important freedom is and how you come to cherish it and how you come to understand its theological and spiritual dimension when you lack it, when you don't have freedom. So this is something that writers from this former communist or Soviet bloc they can bring as a testimony to the world of today.
I think especially since over the past few years, we have seen people very afraid at the perceived limitations on personal freedom, particularly in a religious context. And that's why I find him so such a fascinating person, because very often when we're embattled, it's very easy to form a kind of myopic sort of focus and to retreat from the world. But instead we have Steinhardt not just engaging, but appreciating and finding joy in Bob Dylan, and I find that completely extraordinary. Yeah, it's so applicable and to our modern context. So I hope that with the forthcoming publication of these works, they're disseminated and.
There is also, being prepared for publication also, and translated as we speak, his book of sermons. I think, in a sense, from a theological point of view, his book of sermons will be more valuable. It's called something like "By Giving You Shall Receive." So soon these things will be with us. And you're right. And he was a very particular, very sort of different person. I mean, he was always, I say he was a nonconformist, and he really was. And he didn't become, extremely, he didn't change his life once he became a monk. I remember reading that he would play in the monastery, he would play music in his room, mostly classical, but sometimes also modern music. And I think he just had to. His love for art was absolutely immense. Like he would just listen to classical music with tears rolling down his cheeks. It was really a lover of art. But yes, you'll have to read the General J to understand just how much importance he placed on art and what spiritual significance he found in art of all kinds. He was a literature man himself. He wrote a lot of literary criticism, so literature was his main sort of field, but he loves all arts, and he was interested in everything. It was like completely a thirst for knowledge, yes, which he always displayed. I think Frank has a question.
Well, first I want to echo what Deacon David shared about this notion that, and this is my introduction to Steinhardt, so I haven't read any of his work or wasn't aware of him, one of those folks. But what he said about basically this individual who had both feet in the world and yet was able to continue with this expression of joy. And to me, positive Christianity or positive Christians are always very inspiring. that, the two world wars, the communists, imprisonment, all of this that this man has been through, for us, and I guess I can only speak for myself, I haven't been through anything like that. And for him to maintain this joy, and I guess it ties into for me, an observation, and maybe I'm not on this, but it's impressive in the quotes that you included in your slides that, in my mind, he's speaking on the victory of the resurrection every time he speaks. And that's really what's fueling him. And yet he never mentions the resurrection, but it comes through again and again and again and again. And it's remarkable writing.
Absolutely, I fully agree. Yes, he even said somewhere, I entered the prison a complicated man, morose, depressed, frustrated, and he describes very much what I would say about myself today. It's what many of us are like in this day and age. And then he says, and I came out a free person, free of anger, free of, and it's of course, it's also, it's his mystical experience in prison, but also the fact that you see things in a different perspective. When you're in. First of all, he was about to die. He was convicted to 13 years in prison, which meant death for sure. Now, of course, it was luckily he was released after 4 years. But yeah, he was. I think he was 48 when he went to prison. So and he was a frail man. He's not in very good health. He suffered a lot, by the way, also because of that during his time in prison. All sorts of physical and medical ailments. So for him, he literally, saw, encountered death in a sense. Death could come after any of the beatings, any of the tortures, any of the indignities that the prisoners were subjected to. So yes, what he understood in those moments was precisely that positivity. That's the message. That's the, first of all, of course, faith in Christ. But he sees that as a recipe for happiness. He even says it somewhere. Christianity is nothing else but a recipe for happiness. So all of this is very interesting, where he's coming from and what he's bringing to the world. And I think the world ought to pay attention, because we're losing sight of the bigger picture. And paradoxically, when you're imprisoned in a cell, in a claustrophobic space environment, that's when you start to see the big picture. You start to see things in perspective. So yes, I think that is very, very important.
All right. Well, I think we're coming up on the hour. So unless anyone would like to just jump in really with a very short comment or question, I think that we will end it there. Thank you again very much for being with us, for your time and for your presentation, Razvan, and thank you to everyone for being here. Again, a recording of this meeting will be made available in the near future. And this is the final forum lecture. So we will convene again in the spring. Thank you very much for a very successful full semester. Those of you who have come to all of these lectures, thank you very much. And
may I add a few words? If you have a little patience, I am from Romania. I was an unbeliever. I mean, I was an atheist, and I am one of those who converted to Christianity because of his work, Journal of Joy. And for me, it's very important in my life, Nicolae Steinhardt. And yet I have a little comment about this. There's a saint in Bulgaria called Saint Boris, who was the ruler of Bulgaria, who was also a monk at the end of his life. But yet he's not revered as a monk. I mean, for me, there's something to add here. Some people who doesn't know him would understand that he is a sort of spiritual father from a monastery because he ended his life in a monastery. I think it would be something to confusion spread by this perspective, because somebody would understand that this type of life was common in nowadays monastic life in Romania. I think that's not common, very common. He was something very different, and we should focus on his work as a writer, or on his very brave character as a political prisoner. I think there would be a big confusion to see him as a wonder maker in a monastery. I mean, something is not useful to have false expectation. I mean,
absolutely. This is a very good comment. Thank you so much for making it. That's very true. In fact, the Journal of Joy, which has converted many people to Christianity.
I'm a theologian now.
At the time of when he wrote it, he was not in the monastery. I mean, it was long before he went. It has nothing to do. You are very right. He found his peace in the monastery, but he is not famous because he was in the monastery. Not at all. Most of the work, I think, he had already written before joining the monastery. Perhaps some of it came during his years in the monastery, but yes, he didn't just withdraw in the monastery. He kept close contacts with the world, including contacts with people with whom he wasn't supposed to be in contact, like Eugeniu Ionescu or Mircea Eliade or other of the Romanians outside of the borders who were not living in the communist nightmare. But I absolutely agree with you. In fact, who would agree with you? Steinhardt himself would agree with you. He would be the first to say, this has nothing to do with me being a monk. This is
he wrote the Journal of Joy while being in a monastery, but this was an exception. So it was very extraordinary, and he was published after his death. I mean,
yes.
That was a wonder, because
yes, he passed away I don't know what it was, like half a year before communism fell.
And the secret police tried to steal his manuscript. Yeah.
Oh, it stole it twice. They confiscated the original manuscript.
But he has a third version.
Yes, this is the sort of person that we're talking about. He writes a book, is confiscated like a few days after he finishes it. He sits back down and he writes another one. Because of this, there are now a number of variants of the book which are slightly different. But he just wanted that to get out. He found it very important for people to know. And indeed, when the book came out after communism fell, like a year or two after, it was, for Romanians, it meant a great deal. It still does. It's still a bestseller in Romania up to this day and 20 years later. So yes, it's like, it's a strange situation of a book which is so popular and famous in Romania. Everybody sort of knows about it, even people who are not necessarily interested
And he left on purpose a manuscript to be confiscated by the secret police just as a bait, not to, because the secret police thought it confiscated, but he has another one to be published.
Eventually, it had a number of copies. Yes,
so clever.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, thank you.
And on this note, I would like also to thank Father David and Frank and all at USK for making this series of events possible and for inviting me to this last one. Thank you all for having the patience to listen to me. And when the book comes out, it'll all make a lot more sense. But until then, you'll have to be satisfied with this. But thank you all for coming. Thank you, USK, for inviting me, and I hope we'll keep in touch.
Thank you very much, Razvan. And when the book does come out, we will make an announcement and come back together again. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
God bless you, everyone. I'll leave it there. Thank you.